Hello again. This is Kenny Fife, host of your iKnowMedia Roundtable, where we bring you conscientious clarity through both empirical experience and reasoned analysis and application. How are you today, Elisa?
I'm doing great. Hey guys, I'm Elisa Simmons and I am a mother of two and a Montessori guide and an interpreter of weird child behaviors.
Hi everyone, my name is Jayshree Ellis. You can call me Jay. Many people call me Jay. I am a mom of three. I'm a physician, I'm a disability advocate, and excited to be here tonight, and I'm eager to hear commentary from my comrades.
Awesome. So we had a show we did on Sunday, a few days ago, and we were going to talk about the Black Lives Movement issue going on out in Portland, and how it's ironic that a city with an African American population of approximately 6% had become a little bit of the epicenter of the Black Lives Movement, and whether there was some contradiction that now it was becoming about Trump and federal power versus local power and white protesters and losing sight of it. But we also want to kind of table that a little bit until Michael gets back, because we had a good half show recorded and then we ran into some technical difficulties. And with that in mind, today we decided that we just do something, not that every show isn't fun, but fun, and just talk about something that everyone might be interested in, and that would be parenting. So how will we bring in parenting into thinking about what we've been trying to do here at the iKnowMedia Roundtable, which is to talk about the movement that's going on and keeping energy going vis-a-vis the George Floyd murder, et cetera. And so how do we talk about interesting topics, but stay on topic and get mileage out of people being conscientious about race and family and what's going on in the world? And so parenting, we're all impacted by it, whether you have children or you don't have children. How you deal with people in the store, in the line at the grocery store, or parking cars, or people merging at lights, or just generally human behavior. And so this is not just about parenting, but it's about raising and preparing. So preparing your children to the world. Relate that to iKnowMedia's Roundtable, what's going on in the world. Parenting is tough enough. There's ups and downs. There's heartbreaks. There's joys. There's misgivings. There's self-doubt. There's growth. We regret, I coulda, I woulda, I shoulda. And then throw in parenting in the new world of diversity with mixed marriages, mixed families, blended families, and transracial adoptions. And so we're going to go around the horn, and we're going to have some guests today. So it was fun. I'm wearing a hat, and we're going to have two guests dial in. Brian may already be in there. He is actually another University of Pennsylvania compadre. And then Gayla Gower from Tulsa, Oklahoma. You guys know I lived in Oklahoma over 20 years, and so Gayla is of that Tulsa crowd of folks. And so let's get started, and I will tell you in a second what brought this idea on, but I'll give you a chance to free flow and just, talk a minute about not necessarily deep issues, but we all like talking about our kids. So Elisa, since we've got that lovely young person next to you, you should talk about your children real quick.
You know what? I have one child that I've given birth to. She's right here, and she very much is, I am raising myself, and I'm enjoying every minute of it. She is very much like me in every way, except she has a better tan. That's about the only difference. And my husband and I are also raising our nephew. So he's my son. He's 10. And then we've co-parented two of my nieces that are now adults, and for a huge majority, a niece and nephew of ours that are now adults too. And so we're all very close still to this day. So this is a really fun conversation. I also counsel a huge amount of parents through my school on parenting issues, and enjoy the conversation a lot.
Great.
Jayshree, and this is Kay Marie.
I'm sorry?
Her name is Kay Marie.
Hey, Kay Marie.
Hi.
Jayshree, you want to tell us about your folks?
Yes, well, I'm a mom of three. My oldest is Taylor, and she's 18, and she is now home from college. My next child is Bobby. He's my oldest son, and he's 15. He's a rising 10th grader. And my third child is Jimmy, and Jim is 12. And as many of you know me, Jim has autism, and so that presents a whole new set of challenges as a parent.
Okay, gotcha. Well, I have two children. My oldest son, Miles, is 28, and my daughter is 20. They are both March birthdays. Miles just got married last weekend in Oklahoma City. He's a police officer in Oklahoma City, having a wonderful life. He enjoys it. Sydney is a rising junior, I guess about to be a junior right now in a few weeks, here in Knoxville, Tennessee at the University of Tennessee. And it has been a joy and a pleasure and ups and downs and a lot of love and frustration. And as a father, probably the first big lesson that I learned, I'm so smart, right, is that he wasn't me. That was the first big lesson that I learned as a man. He thinks like himself, not like me necessarily. In fact, he thinks better than I do in many cases. Said, the thing that really introduced me to this, I'm going to save it for Brian. I wonder if our guest Brian is here yet. If Brian is here, let me take a look at the notes here, and let's bring Brian in and say hello.
There he goes. Hey, Brian.
Hello.
Mr. Jeffries, how are you?
I'm good. And yourselves?
I am doing wonderful. Good to see you, friend.
Oh.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. Well, it's been about a year, almost exactly, when I went out to California and I saw you out in Oakland and we hung out.
That's right.
And had some food.
That's right. That was nice. Oh, I lost that last word. Yeah, there we go.
So, Brian, can you hear me okay?
I can now, yeah.
Okay, so we had an introduction about today. And one of the reasons that Brian is a good guest on this show today, guys, is that Brian, I think his mother is white and his father is black. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I met Brian at the University of Pennsylvania as a freshman, where I won't say we liked the same girl because it was his girlfriend. and I was a freshman, and I thought she was like awesome and amazing, and then I found out she had a boyfriend, and it was this knucklehead. But anyway, Brian grew up, and I think, don't let me put words in your mouth, but I think Brian was raised with the identity of a young black man, although he's biracial. And he went to the University of Pennsylvania and pledged the black fraternity. And I've seen things on Facebook from time to time where Brian is chiming in on like a political issue, and someone will type like, well, what do you know about it, based on his photo? And I think what they're trying to say is, what do you know about this issue, white dude?
Basically.
Right? But we're talking about parenting today, and I'll repeat this again when Gayla comes in, but I have a good friend who said to me, Kenny, what do you think about everything that's going on these days? Because one of our friends, this is him talking, one of our friends said, we don't see your kids as black. Well, he's a white male with a white wife and 4 adopted black children. And that's a loaded thing to say. So let's start off with whatever you want to tell us, Brian. But first, everyone got a chance to talk for, 30 seconds or so about their children. So tell us about your children, whatever you want to say about parenting, and then let's jump into that.
Got it. So I have 2 kids, a 20-year-old, how'd I get so old, and an 18-year-old. My 18-year-old, that's my daughter, she's a little bit darker than me, like a tiny, tiny bit. And she goes to Howard. My son is darker than that, so he's identifiably, like, if you look at his skin, he's not white, right? You don't have to look at his facial features or his hair or anything like that. So he's 20. He's identifiably, obviously brown. One of the funny things about the here and now is that, and Kenny and Jay, you can testify to this better than I can, but I think I was perceived, at Penn, as a light-skinned black man, not as biracial, which was hilarious. Because I'm like, look, same color on both sides of my hands, how can you not know that my mom is white or that one of my parents is white? And pardon me, I keep reaching down because my dog, is like a toddler. So whenever there's paying attention to something that's not him. You know, he wants my attention. But yeah, so I, you know, it's certainly, you know, from high school and beyond, was perceived as a light-skinned black man. I wasn't really perceived as being biracial by most folks. My kids, because there are so many more biracial kids now than there were when I was growing up, are both perceived as biracial, even though both their parents are black, which I find endlessly amusing. It's just, you know. And then, you know, my daughter going to Howard, she's really leaned into her black identity in a way that, you know, my son hasn't really in that same way, even though he's more identifiably black. So it's really kind of an interesting thing, and race is a constant conversation in our house. So there you go.
Okay, got it. So I was, you were raised sort of as black consciousness in terms of a light-skinned black man.
So that's a little more complicated. You know, my parents separated when I was about 10 years old. So growing up before then, you know, I grew up in a restaurant. There's a bunch of kind of, you know, restaurant environments, especially in the 70s, are very hippies and weirdos. You know, my dad was a musician. And so it was a multiracial environment, and we really didn't talk about race that much, even though growing up in Philly in the 60s and 70s, race was, you know, everywhere. So I, you know, honestly, I struggled with, you know, who I was and where I fit. One of you know, my frat brothers who grew up in Philly, I asked him about you know, his high school, Central High, and I asked him what the racial breakdown was. He said, "Oh, it's about 30% black, about 30% white, about 30% Italian, and about, you know, 10% everything else." I was like, "Wait, Italians aren't white?" No.
I bet that was Leon, wasn't it? Was that Leon?
That was Leon. Yes, Leon said that.
Okay.
So, you know, race was a constant thing in Philly of the time. And, you know, I didn't really fit anywhere. So it wasn't until I went to high school, went to boarding school at Choate, where it was really kind of made clear to me by the white kids that I didn't fit there. And it was really a binary. There was white kids and there was black kids. And, you know, black and Latino, but black and Puerto Rican meant, you know, they were part of the black community. Yeah. So the black kids very, you know, very much welcomed me into the community, that, you know, racially based community. And so that really was the beginning of being welcomed, you know, fully Gotcha. Into a significant community. So by the time I got to Penn, you know, it was, you know, my identity.
So you guys, watch how small the world is, right? So I know Brian from Penn, and he just talked about going to Choate, but I went to Northfield Mount Hermon, but that's where you became with Robert, whom I also know because I played basketball against Robert when he was at Choate and I was at Northfield. Right. So Jay and Lisa, let's lean into this a little bit. And Jay, it's not necessarily your opinion, but can you share a little bit about what typically the black community believes about parenting? Like, what might be some differences that we have perceptions on, even if there's stereotypes about black parenting versus white parenting? And then we'll transition over to Elisa. And Elisa, tell me what your experience is with that. So go ahead, Jay.
Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of stereotypes that I don't know where they started, right? But I think there's always that stereotype that white parents are not strict enough with their children, that they're certainly not as strict as black parents are, and that they're more permissive and allow things to go on that most black families would find disrespectful. So, I mean, that is a stereotype. I have to say that, you know, growing up, I didn't have a lot of white friends whose houses I got to go to. I did have one classmate in the 6th grade, and I remember being at her house for a slumber party one weekend. And like, I really couldn't believe how she spoke to her mother, and that her mother like didn't murder her. Actually kind of went back and forth with her, but she was absolutely disrespectful. That was something that seemed to reinforce that stereotype for me. But as an adult, I met a lot of families, and particularly mothers, because it seems like this always falls on the mother, right? The white woman who's not necessarily strong enough, she kind of lets her kids run over her. I know quite a few white mothers who would get into their kids more than I would get into mine. So it's definitely a stereotype, and I don't know where it comes from. But I think that there are many white families who are just as strict, and that there are many who will mete out justice, so to speak, just as harshly as a Black family might. But I think that is a prevailing stereotype, that they just aren't strict with children.
Okay. Producer, if we can bring back Brian in any time before we bring in Gayla. Elisa, what
I'm
can you
still
tell us
here. I
about
just had
that
to
real
feed my
quick?
dog.
Okay, Brian.
You know what? I actually just recently, last summer, I think there's a lot of growing up. I had friends. I truly had a multicultural experience. Not necessarily my closest friends. My closest friends tended to look very similar if you needed to group them. But my exposure was very diverse. And so I was able to see Filipino moms and Korean moms and Black mothers and white mothers. And I would always hear these different stereotypes. And what was so funny to me is that many of the stereotypes were true, and then, but also blanketed other ones. I know for me personally, I am really into hair. I love doing hair. I've done hair for as long as I can remember. And my two nieces that I've co-parented, they are both Black. And I was in charge of their hair forever. And I wanted them to have the beauty shop experience. And so I took them to I hunted a Black beauty shop in my area. And they had gorgeous hair. And I was like, I'm going to give them this experience. And when I took them in there, it was in the middle of the summer. We just finished, I had let them wear their hair down for a week just to let it relax. And the woman was the rudest you could imagine. She openly said to this 12 and 13-year-old girl, you can't let anybody touch your hair. Don't let anybody just in, and like pointed at me, and I'm the one that brought them in. And so I think that those stereotypes of you can't do your child's hair, I took her to get a style done before school last year. And the woman wasn't going to accept her as a client because she doesn't like to do biracial children's hair because they don't know how to sit still in the chair because their moms don't do their hair. And I was like, well, she can sit.
Wow.
And so I think that there are a lot of stereotypes that go along with them. And I can identify some of them that seem to be true, but I can also see those in other races too, Jay, like when you were talking about discipline and all that other neat fun stuff.
Gotcha. So, producer, if we can bring in Gayla and say hello to Gayla, that would be great. If she's ready there. Hello, Gayla.
Hi there.
How are you?
I'm good this evening. How are you guys?
Wonderful. How are things in Tulsa?
Oh, well, you know, it's Oklahoma, so amazing.
Great. Well, we've got Houston, Oakland. I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee. And Elisa, I know you're in Texas, close to Houston, but what's your town?
I'm closer to Dallas. I'm in Tyler.
Oh, okay. You're in Tyler. I forgot. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I've prepped slightly Gayla on the subject matter, and she agreed gracefully with about 2 hours prior to the show time to come on. Gayla, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll go from there.
Sure, absolutely. Well, yes, I live here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Before COVID, I only lived here about half the time. I would travel for my work. I'm a literacy consultant. I get to work with schools all over the country, working with teachers, making sure everybody uses best practices to teach kids how to read.
Okay, great. And the reason I asked you to join, as I talked about parenting, whether it's the pitfalls, the ups, the downs, the stereotypes, the challenges, the love, the self-doubt, the growth, all of those things that come with parenting, and then add that to, so Gayla was laughing at me earlier today. I didn't know the term, right? Sometimes I'm like this 53-year-old guy going on 73. I'm just like, oh, white person with black kids, black person with white kids, but it has a name, and it's called what?
Sure, transracial adoption.
Transracial adoption. I was like, I didn't know that. So can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Sure. Well, I have two sons that are biological. And then my ex-husband and I adopted our daughter 10 years ago. She was born in Ethiopia. And it was just one of those things that was on my heart for a really long time. And feel like the luckiest person in the world to have my daughter in my life. However, that doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean that I don't think adoption is ever easy. I think adoption itself is very challenging. And I'm very open with my daughter about that. I try to talk to her about her story as much as possible. I want her to know everything that I know. And I've told her many times, adoption is happy and sad. If the world was a more fair and just place, there would be no need for adoption, right? My daughter never would have ended up in an orphanage if the world was a more fair and just place. And so I've told her many times, it's okay for you to be sad about that for forever. You can always be sad because you lost your first family, you lost your first culture, you lost your first everything that was taken from her, and frankly, me, right? And it's also at the exact same time, it's okay to say adoption is happy because you love your family and we're great together. And so those are two things that I think she's going to have to hold in her hands her whole life.
Well, I think what's beautiful about what you just said is the absolute recognition of her original culture and her original family and those things that were, as you describe it, taken from her. I won't judge others because I think anyone who takes another person into the home that's not biological or anything else, is showing a lot of love and a lot of heart. But one of the things that I think is missed is the preparation for the world. And so if you are involved in a transracial adoption and you sort of pretend things like, I don't see color, then you're not really preparing that child for the world. And so where are the challenges, and if we can go around the horn with this, and then we'll freestyle a little bit, but what are the challenges in everyone's mind, balance, love, and just allowing a child to be an individual? Because there's been sad about, speaking of sadness, for example, as a father of a Black male, a 10-year-old boy should just be allowed to be a boy and play. But as a 10-year-old Black male who may look 13, you've got to prepare him for the aggressiveness of the world. And so you steal a little bit of his childhood. And so how do you balance this idea of raising a child in a happy place where they don't have pressure, but making them understand because of the color of their skin and the reality of the world that we live in, without giving them a chip on their shoulder, that they've got to understand that egalitarian ideal of just work hard and do the next right thing is going to work when it isn't always true for people of color. You want to tackle that one? Whoever wants to go first, Elisa, Jay, Brian?
Let me jump in there real quick. So, that's always been that challenge right there has always been the thing, with my son. We live in a primarily white suburb of Oakland. And, it's kind of Mayberry-ish. I mean, it's a funny suburb because it's literally like it's bordered by Oakland on all sides. So it's actually kind of like inside of Oakland. And, I remember when airsoft guns were like the big thing. Aaron was about 10 years old. And so he wanted to go and, run around with his friends with these airsoft guns, which look like, actual firearms, shooting at each other. And I was like, no, there is zero chance that's going to happen. And that was one of the first times we really got into the idea that things that weren't dangerous for his friends are dangerous for him. And yeah, you steal a little bit of their childhood, but you want them to make it to adulthood. And that's been the age-old, I think, challenge for Black parents, which in some ways gets back to the thing that we were talking about earlier with regards to being strict. The whole thing, Jay, of, Black parents saying, I'm going to beat you at home so that the police don't beat you, later. Work is really trying to get my attention. I'm going to have to mute for a second.
Well, you know what? As Brian was saying, I just recently had such a similar issue happen. My son went to visit his mother for the weekend, and he came back and he was all excited because she'd given him a cap gun. And I was like, hey, because my son is in the 99th percentile in height, and he is also pretty dark skinned. and he's regularly mistaken for an older child. And him and we've had this conversation before, but we had to have the conversation that this looks too similar to a real gun. And we had to bring up Tamar Rice, and it was sad to be able to give him an exact reference to someone that's just a little bit older than him, and explain why we had to make the decision that we had to make, that he can't play with a cap gun because it sounds so similar to a real gun. And we had to tie it in with the issue that just happened. I think it was in Louisville, where there was one gunshot heard and it started a domino effect.
I think Jayshree, you want to chime in a little freestyle? What do you have to add there?
Well, I mean, I think that for me, in terms of raising my kids, I think the dilemma has been, how do I make them aware of challenges, concerns, how the world may view them, keep them aware, but also make sure that they're not afraid of white America or angry and resentful with white America, right? Because they need to be able to live in America and thrive and be able to work with whomever is alongside them without being completely untrusting or afraid or just angry. And I think that's always the fine line we have to walk. And every time we have a significant occurrence based upon race, you know, we have to kind of revisit this and talk about that awareness, but then not too much, because you got to go out there in the real world and you can't segregate yourself. This is not your world. And that's just always a challenge, and really trying to make sure that as they watch all of this, their spirits aren't broken by what they see go on, that they just don't decide that the world is just simply against them, because that's just as harmful. So I think it's always hard to kind of stay right in the middle and just have there be enough emotion that they can make good choices, but not so much fear that they just deny themselves opportunities.
Sure.
And in this moment right now, we're at a bit of an inflection point in terms of the way race is happening in this country. And, you know, I had this, I don't say flashback, because, you know, I had this sort of moment of, you know, my son wanted to go down to one of the protests that I had and I've taken him to protests, taken both my kids to protests since before they can remember. But I had the intuition that this one was going to get a little dicey. And, you know, he very much wanted to go to this protest. And I just had this imagination of, you know, what parents during the civil rights movement, you know, had to think about. Like, yeah, we want there to be change, but do I want to put my kid on the front line of that? That's where we are.
Yeah. So speaking of front line, some of you here already know that my son is a police officer in Oklahoma City. And if you talk about a juxtaposition, there were two photos, one of my daughter and one of my son. So my 20-year-old daughter had on her sort of bandana, which looks almost like the Banksy version that I have on my Facebook of the flowers and you know, sort of like protesting, but it was really because of COVID-19, right? So everyone was doing the mask thing, but she had the fist and the Black Lives Matter sign. And juxtaposed in a split screen that their mother put together was our son in his riot gear coming down over his face, and on the other split screen, my daughter with the Black Lives Matter. So talk about children and parenting in juxtaposition. Gayla, I'm gonna aim this one at you. Feel free to talk around it or switch the subject, but these are some curiosities.
Sure.
Not only are there serious things that we shouldn't have to think about as human beings, God's children who bleed the same, but your daughter, as she comes into the age of, you know, whenever that age in of dating, boys, girls, intimacy, thoughts, feelings, hormones, and you live in a place like Tulsa, which is for the state of Oklahoma relatively progressive, but it's still Oklahoma.
Right.
How do you balance, again, just allowing her to be a human being who feels the things that a human being feels, and protecting her from maybe some parents that won't be so nice? Those kinds of serious things, how do you engage those parents? Or since you've had her since a baby, do you already kind of know who those parents are? And then that juxtaposed to the simple stuff, which may not be simple, and maybe I'm being a man with this, but the simple stuff that may be like conversations about hair, right? What do you do about hair and what's that?
Sure, yeah.
So go ahead, jump in, please.
Well, I'll start with hair because I knew that I didn't know what I needed to know, right? But I'll tell you what, YouTube, you can learn to do anything on YouTube. So I educated myself before we ever adopted her. And actually, she wasn't a baby. She was 3.5 when we adopted her. So she still has memories of, you know, Ethiopia and her first family and things like that. But she's 13 now, and very much all of the things you just described are happening. The hormones, good times. But I will say this, what I've been noticing throughout her life here is that up until now, pretty much right at this point, she has been very much, I guess I want to say protected by my white privilege. Because everybody who knew her knew I was her mom. Everybody who knew her knew she was in a white family. And I think that probably didn't do her any favors, because now she's in middle school. Now she's interacting with people who don't know her family. And so we talk a lot about what it means to have a foot in two worlds and how that's going to be her reality for forever. You know, let's face it, she's culturally white. I mean, she can sing along with U2. That's pretty white, right? But at the same time, when she goes to school, she's Black. She is a Black girl in school. So she has said to me before, she's like, Mom, people say that they said to me today, why do you talk so white? And I said, really? Who said that to you? Was it a white girl or a Black girl? She said, oh, only Black girls say that. And I said, well, what do you say to them? And she's like, it's called adoption. My mom's white. And I mean, at this point, she lets it roll off of her. But at the same time, this is going to be in her life that she will have to deal with, being raised in a white family. She's submerged in white culture, but then having to determine who she is, you know, regardless, as we all do. We all have to come to that point where we have to identify, who am I? Aside from how I was raised and where I was raised, who am I? And I think it's going to be perhaps more challenging for her than for most, just because she's going to have to wrestle with Black identity in the midst of white culture. And the fact of the matter is, I am more than humble enough to say, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not coming at this like, I got this. No, I don't got this. I need all the help I can get. So listening to experiences of my Black friends and letting them say things to me when they notice things that I didn't notice because it wasn't my experience, right? I think that's really key. I'm not sure I really answered your question if I skirted it. Did I?
No, that's perfect. I love that you're aware. I think your awareness of the reality of race issues is refreshing, versus I'm not insulting anyone else in the world, but versus the idea that we're all God's children. Let's pretend it doesn't exist.
Well, and if I could just kind of bounce off what Brian was saying about going to protests and things like that. I'm a very active protester here in Tulsa. I drag my kids to all of them. And obviously recently we were at a lot of Black Lives Rally marches and meetings and peaceful protests in parks. And at one particular one, it was just my daughter and myself. My sons didn't come with us. And someone was speaking about their experience in trying to get a job and how the name on their resume had them viewed differently than the same credentials, and on, you know, this is a very familiar story. And to be honest with you, I just started weeping because I realized that my daughter doesn't necessarily know about those things yet. And like Jayshree and Brian and Elisa, you guys have had those conversations probably in a better manner than I have. Partly because she's a girl. I don't know. It really just, the weight of those conversations just fell upon me and I just started crying, which totally mortified her. She's 13 and I'm the most embarrassing person on earth right now. But when we were leaving, we were driving away and I was just saying to her, you know, what do you think about that? When you hear that, how does that feel to you? And she just kind of, you know, she's 13, so it's very hard to talk about feelings and emotions with your mom right now. But she was like, it's sad. And I'm like, yeah, it's sad and it's wrong. And Listen, like I said, I'm making this up one day at a time. What I said to her was, you know, there are times when I want to say to you, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that this country is the way it is and that I brought you into it because that was my choice. You didn't have a say in this. This happened to you, right?
Right.
And I brought you into a place and a time in history that is rough.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And as much as I love her, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I love her so much, but I cannot deny the fact that this is hard.
Yeah. Who wants, Jay, Elisa, who wants to follow that with what?
You know, we used to live in Tyler, where Elisa lived. And when we were moving here, at the time, we just had Taylor and Bobby, and they were little. Like Taylor was like 4 and Bobby was like 1. And I remember being afraid to move to a place in Texas that I had just not heard of before. I was like, where the hell, what, Tyler? Right? Because I'm thinking tumbleweed, and it just, my imagery was not good. And I had 2 fears, and they were competing fears. So one fear was that my kids would get here and experience overt racism, you know, get called all kinds of names, not have friends, be ostracized. But then my other fear was that they would get here and be completely accepted by their white counterparts. And I was afraid of that because I felt like if that happened, they may not ever be aware or understand that race will many times play a role. So it's like I didn't know which would be worse, you know, that but it was a scary thought that they would just have such a great time, and then they go out into the world and discover that there are going to be a lot of people who don't appreciate them simply because of the color of their skin. And I think that that's always kind of in your consciousness as a parent raising a child who's Black, whether or not biracial. I think it's harder if it is a transracial situation, right? Where if you haven't seen the experience a lot, because there's some people who have, right? There will be some white people who've grown up around Black people and been close to them, and they've seen the racism and they know the impact it has on the people that they've loved. But either way, as a parent, you're in such a vulnerable position because you realize how vulnerable your kids are. And that's part of what's so bittersweet about parenting, right? So I think we feel like we could get through whatever we had to. We do not want to see our children suffer. We do not want to see our children victimized. And so it's very difficult. And sometimes I just would feel helpless. And all I could do is say, well, I'm just going to pray because I don't know what else to do. And I don't know how to prepare them. And it's like you have to always be ready to pivot based on their experiences. That could just be a day-to-day thing. Maybe they have a great time for 3 months and then they come home with a kid who won't play with them because of their color of the skin. Or kind of like you mentioned, like my kids have gone through this, where Black kids are like, why are you trying to act white? You talk white. It is talk white, right? But I mean, Black people still say that. This was when President Obama was in office. And I was like, well, if you met his daughters, you'd be saying the same thing about his daughters, right? But even coming from the Black community, there is that we still have to deal with and contend with, and still be able to raise kids who are comfortable in their skin, comfortable with how they've been raised in your home. If this is how you talk, I don't think you should have to speak to the dialect of whoever's talking to you just to be accepted. But sometimes Black people will expect that. So there are some challenges.
Yeah, and so that's one of those things where, as we've said in this podcast before, one of our themes is that 2 things can exist in the same space. And so we've been around it long enough that our kids don't necessarily get it. So I shared in one of our other podcasts that my mother used to say to me, because I said so. And so I told myself I was never going to say that to my children. But I found myself, when my son was younger, saying, okay, your life's experience doesn't allow you to comprehend it if I explained it to you, so trust me, which is really the same thing. We're going with that. What exists in the same space is I'm old enough and I have enough experiences to know that I can't walk around with a chip on my shoulder, but I also have to be aware. So as an adult, particularly in my 20s, when I was still like, you know, looking like, if a white male in a business setting said to me, hey, did you play ball somewhere? Sometimes I'd lie and say no, because I felt like that's all he talked to me about because I was a Black male. But then at the same time, what exists is because of my physique, it made sense to ask me that question, right? And so I had to balance and figure out from that person's countenance which way he was meaning it, right? Like, can he only talk to a black man about, or is it my physique and the reason he's asking? So with that said, how do you pass that to your children, protect themselves when it's necessary, and understand what danger looks like? I saw in the midst, and I'm not digressing too much, but I'm adding a piece of like I always try to. I saw a little clip recently where a guy was talking about getting the Confederate flag, and he was a black gentleman. He's been funny, and I may have shared it with one or two of you. And he said, "Come on, guys, getting rid of the Confederate flag? I don't know. It's been kind of useful to. What if I'm in a little town in Mississippi and I'm getting gas and I see that Confederate flag and I'm like, this is not a good place for me to get gas. Or, you know, if I break down, you know, on the side of the road and I choose a house to knock on, that flag in the window lets me know don't knock that door." So that levity into seriousness, Elisa, what have been some of your challenges if you've had them in a place like Tyler, Texas, being a white woman, raising black teenage girls, having a biracial daughter right there, that's your genetic child, biological child, helping with your, I think your nephew also?
Yes, we're raising our nephew.
And being out in public and dealing with making the looks of the sort of patronage, like there in those scenarios.
Yeah, well, you know what? The story with the Confederate flag, do you remember the way to Grandma's house?
Yes.
On our way to Grandma's house, my grandma used to live in a little town called Sulphur Springs in Texas. It's about an hour and a half north of us. And when we go on that route, remember the house we would pass past the lake? What did they have? You got to talk louder. They had the Confederate flag hanging up. And so in our family, we don't shy away from race. That's one of the reasons why I'm not uncomfortable with her sitting here talking with us. She's been to a lynching museum in Montgomery. She's been to many different historic sites in our country. But with the Confederate flag on the way to Grandma's house, I'm a planner. And I was like, hey, so let's discuss which houses on this path should be the last place we stop for help. But when I talk about that as the last place, I also point out that there are some people who truly believe that their intentions behind that flag are just Southern pride, and it's not them being racist. They don't understand that it tells the rest of the world that they may be racist. And they could be very nice people and help us, but they are going to be our last choice, just to be safe. And it's a conversation we've had as a family numerous times. I had my niece, who's now about to be an LVN in December, and she was going to her first football game, and her social group were white. And I remember one time, this is so crazy, one time she was going somewhere and they were going to listen to the whitest music, and they were going to be in the whitest group. And I was really annoyed with her, and I realized it baffled me that she was so white, because I got so much crap for being for like, I couldn't listen to rap music. It was deemed like it was inappropriate for me to listen to rap music. And she had a free pass to listen to rap music and did not. And so I remember, though, that she was going to go to a football game with her friends, who were all 7th grade white girls. And I knew that their big brothers were going to be there. And my husband and I had to have a conversation with her that if any of them use the N-word, even with the soft A, whatever version of it, that she was immediately to call us, and that she was definitely not to go anywhere in the car with them. And the reason we did that, and she knew why, well, we explained why, it was because if they're those White House, that's the town they live in, is White House, if they're those White House typical rednecks, the ideal of saying that word in front of you and getting the approval to say that word in front of you would then open it up for more disrespect, and you would not be alone with those boys. And so that night, my husband and I stayed fairly close to the football game, because if we were going to get a phone call, we were going to be there. And I think sometimes when I explain this to my friends who think we talk about race too much, they don't realize how much of a daily or weekly conversation race can be it you get followed in a store because you have your backpack. And Kenny, like you were saying earlier, that instance where it was like, was it because you have an athletic body? I remember my niece was being followed and I was there and they didn't know I was with her. And I was going to kill this woman. I was waiting for her to talk to my niece. And then I realized my niece's backpack was unzipped. So it might, maybe they should have followed her because her backpack was unzipped. So I just pulled her and I was like, hey, zip your backpack up right now. Like in front of the woman, I was like, hey, your backpack is unzipped. And so there's those moments where it's like, am I going too far? Am I just seeing things that aren't there? But you have to be aware. And like you guys were all saying, without putting that chip on their shoulder, we talk about race a lot, but we don't want to, I don't single out people as bad. It's just habits that we need to help them break.
Great. So before adding two serious questions, this is also a serious comment, but Jay, I hope you don't feel shut out last, but Gayla, because of her family dynamic, Elisa, because of her family dynamic, and Brian, because of being raised by mixed parents. Gayla, you weren't here earlier. Brian's mother's white, his father's black. That we have a little less on some of these questions. But one of the things that I will speak to is something that Jay Cherie spoke to when we were talking about the young lady who had the trouble at whatever restaurant it was, and the pregnant lady pulled the gun on her. So as Black folks, a lot of times an issue we deal with is not wanting to air our dirty laundry and be sort of loyal to our community. But I'm just going to use that word ignorance exists. You know, Elisa, you talked about sort of those rednecks in Tyler type area. Well, Jay and I have talked about sort of those Black folks who say stupid things like, why you're trying to talk white. And so people are people, we love them, but we're not really concerned about that. Because anyone who would ask you such a stupid question, I'm not so sure that we're going to harp a long time on what they think. They've got a long way to go. With that said, we've all heard it, right? And so, Gail, I wouldn't worry about that one too much, and we'd be happy to have a group discussion with your beautiful child about how that might not be something to worry about.
Well, you know, can I just add a little something to the conversation? And
Sure.
always, I am willing and open to get any feedback because, as I have established, I'm a little bit fly by the seat of my pants, so tell me. But when she was in first grade, she came home and out of the clear blue sky, she said, Mom, none of my friends are Black. And I said, that's not true. And I started naming the people that she played with who were Black. And she said, yeah, but none of my heart friends. And I kind of thought, oh my gosh, I'm blowing it. I'm ruining it. I'm the worst adoptive parent ever. And we just talked about that. Like, why do you think that is? And she's like, I don't know. Like, Billy and Skylar are just my heart. And these are girls who she is still like so tight with to this day. And she just said, I don't know, Billy and Skylar, we just like each other. And I kind of just said, well, that's okay. You know, as long as you're not blocking someone out from being friends with you based on their color or, you know, I don't know. Again, I'm just having this conversation completely unprepared. But when I went to her parent-teacher conference the next week, I brought it up with her teacher and just said, tell me what you see. Does Ave play with the other Black kids? Is this, what's happening? Are you seeing any problem areas? And he was great and he just adored her. And he just really shot me straight and said the obvious, well, you know, culturally she's white. And so I think the other Black kids see her as culturally different, even though they share the same skin color. And they were in first grade, so none of them were like, it was a pretty open-minded school. So it wasn't like any of their parents were giving them any misinformation on either Black or white. But he's like, you know, truthfully, this is just how it's going to be for her. And I so appreciated him speaking to me so clearly and honestly about that. Having said that, since then, there have been instances where, I don't know, that she just can be a little bit, standoffish anyway because she's 13. And so again, just like Elisa said, sometimes it's hard to say, are you being standoffish with that other Black girl because you're 13 and you're kind of a jerk right now? Or what is it? I need to take my blinders off. Like, what is it? How can I parse down and figure out what's really going on here when she doesn't even really know what's going on here, because
Mhm.
this is just
You know,
13-year-old girls.
I would say, as a parent of someone who's had a 13-year-old girl.
one thing that I would say though to you, Gayla, is that sometimes there may be Black children who see her as culturally white, and they just make the observation, and it's not a big deal, right? But then there are likely to be Black people who see her as culturally white or behaving that way, and who will really resent that about her. Unfortunately, I think sometimes when you hear these comments like, why are you talking white? Why are you trying to be white because you speak properly? There's a certain resentment behind it oftentimes. And the suggestion is that the person has sold out. You've sold out your Blackness. You're trying to be white, which means you must have be putting Black people down. And that's kind of where it tends to end, right? Because these are, when you hear children saying it, chances are they've been around parents who say that. They might know someone in the community and be like, I can't stand her. She's always trying to be white. Look at her now. Look at what she's wearing. Look at what she's saying, you know. And so there is a certain kind of animus that goes with it sometimes. And I think that at some point, I don't know if she realizes that, if she's encountered that where it's clear to her that her proper speech or how she carries herself is not appreciated, that it is seen as her selling out. At some point, it is important that she understands the distinction versus someone who just kind of, because I think someone who just thinks she's like culturally white, they're not going to make a big deal about it. They'll be like, I like her. I don't care what she's culturally. She's my friend, right? That's how authentic friendships are. But she does need to know that there may be some members of the Black community who don't, they're going to make assumptions about her heart because of how she presents herself. And they're going to feel that she's somehow rejecting them. And so she does need to be aware that that can happen. What is there to do about it? Not a whole lot, unfortunately. All I think we can encourage our kids to do in these settings is to be themselves and to treat people respectfully. But don't always expect that because somebody's Black, they're going to embrace you. Just like you can't assume that because someone's white, they will not. And one of the things that I would often say to my kids when things would come up, if they had a difficult experience with someone and it seemed to be a very kind of racist interaction, I remind them about the white people in their lives who love them fiercely, and have been there for them, friends that they have that they've grown up with who didn't care what their color was. And I also remind them about times that they've encountered Black people who couldn't stand the ground they walked on just because of how they spoke or how they dressed. And I think we do have to acknowledge that exists and help our kids to navigate the waters by deciding who's really important. Like, do I really need this person? Like, do I care what they think at the end of the day? As long as they don't find themselves in physical confrontations, and that rarely happens, but every now and again, somebody might challenge them. But they do need to know that that can happen, but that there will still be probably more people than those who just rejected them who love them, and that they really have to just remember to judge the person on how they're treating them. And that becomes, I think, the overarching lesson.
So like I've often said, maybe once every other show, Jay Cherie is far more eloquent than I, and she expounds upon and says in a much better way. And you heard me dismiss was ignorant. Cherie was much more eloquent about it. Another thing that I wonder is, before I get to the 10,000-pound question at the end, how do you guys feel about the idea of the toughness and the weight on your heart as a parent of wanting to prepare a child, knowing that if they have brown skin, they will have their first experience with serious racism at some point, or first real experience with disappointment, because they will realize, but for the color of their skin, something just either did or did not occur in their life, and that was the only reason. So as a parent, how do you prepare for that, again, without the chip on the shoulder and without your own heart hurting? Or do you just sort of let that crash happen later, understanding that life somehow, and if you're a spiritual person in your relationship, will take care of itself? I see you shaking your head, Elisa.
You know what? So my husband and I started co-parenting our nieces when we were just 22 years old. And he had just not become comfortable with himself, but he realized he had just started deciding that it was stereotypes did not define him. And even though they never really did, he realized the world did. And so at about 22, he was shrugging those stereotypes off of him. And he was
One
like,
second, by the way, what does that mean? Like your husband, like I think I know what you mean, but if someone's watching this, explain.
my husband happens to be Black. Um,
I see.
um, but no. So at 22, though, in this area, there wasn't there. It was a hard time to see past the world. This area is the area we live in. There's a road called Gentry, and north of Gentry is the Black side of this town, and south of Gentry is everybody else. And so it's hard, but at 22 is when my husband and I took over our Montessori school. We finished our education, and we were at that time becoming comfortable with the ideal that stereotypes did not matter. And so for us, that's also the time we started co-parenting our nieces and nephews. And so here we are at 22 with 4 kids. And so, and for us, though, we decided to embrace it, but without giving the chip. And what we found, they're all now adults. Those 4 are all adults now and successful in their own right. But how we did it was, we want them to try to figure out what causes that person to think that way. Not to give the power over them, but to understand that if somebody grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, and they're white or they're Black, and they've not been exposed to any other Black people outside of Montgomery, Alabama, or any other white people outside of Montgomery, Alabama, their vision is going to be very small and could be quite jaded. And so are their thoughts based on true hatred of you, or because it's been taught to them? Because if someone's disrespectful to you because they've been taught that you're bad, not because they actually know, it's a little bit easier to remain kinder, we have found. And not to bow down to them in any way, but when you're checking that person, do it with a little bit more tender heart, because you know that could be the one moment that person's view on everyone that looks like you could be changed. And that's not your job, but like, it makes it easier to go into those situations. But and then another thing is history, education. We plan vacations around going to multicultural historic places, and in my daughter's like, yes we do. She can tell you. And so for us as a family, that was the way to give them that tool when they went out in the world, that other people's thoughts about them as a Black person oftentimes has nothing to do with them as a Black person, but the information or the exposure of theirs to what they think Black people are. My nieces are called Oreos. Gayla, I am pretty sure at some point your daughter would get called an Oreo. And my niece, it's like, you're Black on the outside but white on the inside. No, I'm educated. My aunt forced me to have a high GPA. And so I think then it also introduces that ideal of code switching. I have a really great friend of mine who, if you hear us on the telephone, you don't know that we're educated, but it's because we're in a relaxed environment. And those are the tools that we try to give to all of our children, regardless of their race. My niece and nephew that we co-parented are white. And so regardless of race, that was our key. Why are they treating you this way? And try to investigate it that way.
And so I like your idea, and I'll chime in on that a little bit. On one hand, we can understand both. Again, things can exist in the same space. On one hand, as a Black person, sometimes, you know what, I'm just exhausted and it's not my job to teach anyone. But on the other hand, you go, if I'm aware, I'm conscious of the world and I want to be a part of the solution, suck it up, here we go again. For example, I get what you're saying about sometimes people only know what they've been around. So I've got an example that's an Oklahoma experience, and I've got an example that's a Massachusetts experience. My Massachusetts experience is with a guy, I won't say his name, but his grandfather co-founded Nabisco. Well, that's sort of what we call old blue blood money. And he said to me once in high school, you know, Kenny, I am sorry. And I said, what are you talking about? I almost said his name. And he said, what I thought of Black people before I spent the last 3 years with you was only what my racist grandmother in Maine told me and my grandfather on Cape Cod told me. He said, we spent the summers on Cape Cod and we summered at Kennebunkport, and I was never around Black people, and all I knew was the stereotypes. And I'm sorry that I thought that. And my years here with you and other students have helped me to unlearn that. the other version of what you're saying, Alyssa, but that was because I took a lot of time with him. The other version is a lot of people of color think that all Trump supporters and voters are racist. That's not true. So you take a guy, they're the people who hear the dog whistle, and they certainly exist, that 35 to 34% of them. But there's that guy, I may have used this example before, who may live in Durant, Oklahoma. He's a roughneck. And for people, I think everyone on this call knows what a roughneck is, but for those who don't, guy who works on an oil rig, he go out into the Gulf or wherever else. He grew up in a little town like Durant or somewhere else. He's never been around black folks other than the guy who played strong safety on his high school football team. And he heard his grandmother who had some funny ideas about race. He's a good husband. He's a good father. He goes to his church and he worships, and he's a good worker, and he doesn't treat anyone badly. But he thinks that the world is changing to his detriment, and his job went to Venezuela, and he doesn't hear the dog whistles, and he just kind of wants a piece of his life back. And his own daughters think he's racist because he doesn't have any friends. So I spend time with a guy like that and befriend him and help spin him around. Not that it's my job, but help him to understand. And so I get it. So that sounds a little down the rabbit hole, but I think it makes sense because it's related to helping our children understand, and helping them understand others helps them to understand who they are.
Yes.
Circling to the $1 billion question I have today, Gayla, as a person who is obviously very consciously aware of the things that you are able to offer your daughter, the places that you feel that you may have some shortcomings, but with a heart for what you feel is sad and happy about adoption, and transracial adoption, what would it say to you about one of your white friends who said to you, what does it mean? What are they saying if they said, oh, but we see your daughter as white, or we don't see your daughter as black? What does that say to you?
That would not go over well. I think what that would say to me is I would want to dig down deep and find out why. Because what that sounds like is you have a negative assumption about Black people. And then you meet my daughter and she doesn't fit your negative assumption. So rather than changing your stereotype, you're putting whiteness on top of my daughter, right? Like, I would not be crazy about that statement. That would be, to me, saying you don't see color is like saying you don't see gender. Like, come on, my daughter is Black. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I would not be a fan. That would not go over well.
What do you think about that comment, Jay?
Well, I mean, I think that, yes, there is, when someone makes comments like that, I think they often are made innocently. I think they often don't realize that it's insulting, right? It's almost like when someone says, well, I'm not racist, I have a Black friend, right? And so those people definitely need to be educated, because I think many times those are really not intended to cause harm, but people just don't realize how emotionally tone deaf that is and racially tone deaf it is. And I think those are good opportunities to kind of teach. But, you know, I think so much of this, when we talk about race as it relates to how we parent and the different things that we have to support our kids through and with, I think it comes down to resiliency and us being able to really teach and encourage that, right? Because, I mean, you'd asked the question previously about how we would deal with something where we see something was denied to our children because of their race, and they know that that was the case, which is devastating to feel as a parent. But I think when you think of, there are always going to be things that happen to them, that can happen to them, that are just unfair, right? And that is part of just life and growing up and learning to navigate the world. Race is among those things, and it's not something that everyone suffers. But at the end of the day, as we prepare them to go into the real world, we have to teach them resiliency, and we have to teach them that they can recover from something that they may have failed at or something that was denied them. I think that we definitely can say to them in a broad sense, you know, the arc of the universe bends towards justice. However, in the space of your life or a short period of time in your life, there may be times when it feels like there's no justice, right, for you or your situation. And hopefully that will not be ongoing, but every now and again, I think every person encounters that if they're out there in the real world enough. I think that when it comes to these discussions about race and recognizing that our kids can have very painful experiences, what we have to teach them is that, just as it was mentioned, they can't let that experience or the thinking of that person who denied them something define them. And that, you know, they have much more to look forward to, and we have to teach them to recognize their own personal value and figure out when they don't need to be around people who would mistreat them. Sometimes you can't escape it. You know, you've got a professor who's just a jerk, and you know that person's racist. He's your professor. You're gonna have to deal with this for a while. But you know, where you can avoid it, you want to stay away from those people who clearly are not there for you. And that's a lesson about whether it's race or it's a gender-based issue, or it's just you have some friends who suck and they're not really your friends, and you need to know that and you need to leave them alone. And so I think that overall we have to always be ready to teach them to be resilient. I think that's one of the most pivotal things that we can teach our children, and to instill in them that they have the confidence and faith in themselves that they can recover from whatever life is throwing at them, whether it's racism, sexism, poverty, you know, and certainly I think among all our families, we have probably had enough resources to have prepared our children academically and socially and in a civic manner to go out into the world and be not only successful, but to be an asset to their communities. I think overall, these are the things we always have to keep in mind as we watch them navigate challenges that will invariably.
Right.
And Jay Cherie, that's such a, I'm sorry, Kenny, go ahead.
No, and that you have to continue to navigate that in a world where we have a variety of friends. In my life, I have a variety of friends that are white and black and other. But you still have to be aware in your love for life and your love for your friends, you have to understand that the world isn't always in your corner. But again, without that chip, for example, my company is called George Fikes LLC. My name is Kenneth. My great-grandfather's name is George, but that's not why it's named that. I just had Fikes, a simple name. I was trying to get contracts. I understood. You guys heard me earlier in the class that you will realize at times in your life as a brown person, but for the color of your skin, this thing did or did not happen. And when I realized that I had I's and crossed all the T's, I need a white guy on my team because everything's going right and I don't have these contracts. So I asked a guy who was a little bit better than me. His name was Danny, but because Fikes, and I made it look like Danny was the boss. And all of a sudden, I started getting those contracts. Just the name is George Fikes, even though I bought him out very shortly after. And I let people think that he was my boss for a long time. That's being creative.
Hey, you got to do what you got to do.
So you were going to say, and I think it's
time. I'm sorry. I was just going to say, Jay Cherie, you reminded me of something, a conversation that I had with one of my sons recently, who is white, about his responsibility, because he's 16 and, you know, he knows everything. The world is his oyster. But he made a comment to me because I was, you know, on one of my weekly rants about Trump and whatever. And he said, Mom, I don't even care about that stuff. I really don't. Like, you talk about this all the time and I just don't care. Okay, wrong thing to say to this mother, right? Because I was like, oh no, you're gonna care. I said, because you are a white male and you are so privileged, you have the option to opt out, and I'm not going to let you. Because you know who doesn't have the option to opt out? And then, you know, just went down the list. And I'm like, you're gonna engage. First, because I'm your mom and I said so. But also because you're a decent human being, right? Like, so teaching our children, you're gonna engage whether you like it or not. So if you're Black, this is how you may engage in the world, and this is when you may need to approach it a certain way. But if you are white, you better get in there. You better get in there and fight.
All right, guys. I think this has been a good idea. Kayla, thank you so much for joining.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
A little bit of notice. Lisa and Jay, it was fun. You guys had fun. Gayla, I don't usually wear a hat, so this was just sort of impromptu, have fun, off the cuff day. Guys, until Sunday, Gayla, talk to you. Goodbye. Talk to you next.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye,
Give me-
Gayla. Thank you for joining
All right.
us.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
So nice to meet you guys.